Hi everyone, welcome to our series on Mark's Gospel. We've got to chapter 15. Chapter 15 records what this Gospel has been building up to, the death of Jesus on the cross. It starts with his trial before Pilate, and as we said last week, the Jewish leaders were able to condemn Jesus to death, but they lacked the ability to carry that sentence out. That belonged to the Romans, and Pilate, the Roman governor, therefore, needed to find some charge to find Jesus guilty. And he was not interested in the charge of blasphemy, but clearly the religious leaders had emphasized that a claim to be the Messiah meant a claim to kingship, which of course was a threat to Rome. And that's why Pilate asks Jesus about this in verse 2. Jesus' response is positive but hesitant because he's not the sort of king that Pilate is thinking of when he asks that. Pilate sees that Jesus is no threat, but he is afraid of the crowd, and eventually, after giving the crowd the choice of releasing Barabbas, the criminal, or Jesus, he gives in and sentences Jesus to death. Like so many others who encounter Jesus in the way through this gospel, Pilate's heart and his flaws are exposed. It's really Pilate who is on trial here, and he is found wanting. But perhaps we are seeing that no one measures up as they stand before Jesus. The detail about Barabbas is actually significant. Barabbas is guilty, but is given, in effect, a not guilty verdict. Jesus takes his place, though he is not guilty, and receives a guilty verdict. Mark is making the point that what is happening as Jesus dies is that the innocent is standing in for the guilty. Jesus is treated terribly. The flogging he receives by Pilate's soldiers was known to kill people, and the mocking of the soldiers reminds us that Jesus had told his disciples that this is exactly what would happen. Jesus is crucified then at 9 a.m. He refuses the wine laced with myrrh so that he would be fully alert to what is happening. His giving of himself is conscious and deliberate. And again, Mark sees significance in the remarks of others. Some mock and say he saved others, but he cannot save himself. But of course, that is the point. If he was to save others, he would have to sacrifice himself. When Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" we get the glimpse of the spiritual suffering that is happening for Jesus, and see that the bearing of sin is much greater than the physical suffering that Jesus is going through. The ultimate consequence of sin is separation from God, and Jesus experiences this forsakenness so that his people would not have to. And then Jesus dies. In this account, Mark shows us again who this is who dies as he records the comments of the centurion in verse 39. Surely this man was the Son of God. This is what Mark told us at the beginning of his gospel. He's been gently saying this to us all the way through as we read. And now he's asking, well, do you see who this is? Because actually the Gentile soldier, the centurion, he has seen it. He is a most unlikely believer, but he sees who Jesus is. We also see what Jesus does here in verse 38 because the temple of the curtain is torn in two. That was the massive curtain that separated the Holy of Holies in the temple from the outer sections. And the Holy of Holies was symbolic of where God dwelt. And the curtain sent a powerful message to say that easy access to God is not possible. But now it is torn and the way to God is open. And notice that it has been torn from top to bottom. So in other words, not by human effort, but it is God who has done it. By the end of the day, the Friday, Jesus is buried in a borrowed tomb. And in telling us about Joseph of Arimathea asking for his body, we actually see Jesus' call illustrated. It was costly for Joseph to side with Jesus. He was a member of the Sanhedrin who had sentenced him to death. Presumably, he had not been present when this was done. But now, when all looks lost, he publicly sides with Jesus. And this is the call that goes to us as well. To see who Jesus is, to recognize what he does in dying for us on the cross, and then to follow him, to side with him, even when it costs. Well, we know the story is not over. And there's a hint of that even here. Pilate is surprised that Jesus is already dead in verse 44. People could take several days to die from crucifixion. But these events were working out to a different time scale and a different agenda. This was all happening according to God's plan. And against all expectations, it's not over. So read chapter 16, and I'll see you tomorrow.